Hey, I'm Sly Grandpa. Let's start our story. I never thought moving back to my childhood neighborhood would feel like stepping into a nightmare I didn't even know existed. The house had been in my family for decades, passed down from my grandfather, who always kept it immaculate, a place where everything had its place and every neighbor respected each other's space. I imagined quiet mornings, the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen, maybe waving at a few familiar faces as I watered the lawn. That was before them, before the nightmare that was my new neighbors. At first, it was subtle, almost laughable. The kid next door would kick a soccer ball into my yard now and then, and I'd return it politely, thinking nothing of it. But subtlety quickly became chaos. Within weeks, I noticed that the "welcome to the neighborhood" vibe had a dark twist. The music started. Not just normal music, but bass-heavy, skull-rattling, wall-shaking tracks that made it impossible to enjoy a cup of coffee without feeling like the floor might give way beneath me. Then came the noise at night. At 2 a.m., doors would slam, tires would screech, and the unmistakable sound of drunken laughter would echo through the thin walls. It wasn't just the volume, it was the sheer disregard for decency. My grandfather's old house seemed to shrink around me as if it were suffocating under the weight of their chaos. I could hear arguments spilling into the street, someone shouting over the other, the occasional glass breaking. I tried reason first. I knocked politely on the door, smiling, hoping to appeal to some shred of civility. The door swung open, and I was greeted with smirks, eye rolls, and the kind of casual disdain that immediately told me I was invisible to them. They didn't apologize, they didn't even seem aware that they were making my life miserable. It was like moving next to a tornado that only existed to ruin your yard and steal your peace. And then the subtle destruction began. My mailbox was dented, my garden gnomes knocked over. At first, I tried to chalk it up to accidents, kids being kids, but accidents don't happen every single morning. Every trash day, my cans were overturned, garbage strewn across my driveway, with their laughter echoing down the street like a soundtrack to my growing despair. My sanity, once solid, now teetered on the edge, each morning worse than the last. I spent nights pacing the living room, staring at the walls my grandfather had painted, imagining him looking down and shaking his head, wondering how the neighborhood had devolved into this chaos. I started keeping a notebook, logging every incident, every insult, every sleepless night. I didn't know what to do yet, but I knew one thing: ignoring them wasn't working. I wasn't just being inconvenienced, I was being invaded. And I promised myself, quietly, to reclaim my home, no matter how long it took. The first week of true chaos had passed, and I realized that the subtle nuisances were only the opening act. By the second week, my peaceful mornings were a distant memory. They had discovered new ways to invade my space, a drone buzzing overhead while I tried to read in the backyard, music blasting from every window, and what I can only describe as a parade of their friends, arriving uninvited as if my lawn were some public park. Every attempt to relax, every plan for a quiet day, was systematically dismantled by their sheer audacity. I remember one Saturday vividly. I was enjoying my morning coffee, savoring the first rays of sunlight as it spilled across the porch, when the unmistakable screech of tires announced their arrival. They had brought a makeshift basketball hoop and set it up directly in front of my driveway. The games began immediately, balls bouncing, thuds pounding against my garage door, and laughter that could have woken the dead. I opened my window, trying to reason through the din, but they waved dismissively, as if my presence didn't matter, their eyes sparkling with mischief or malice, I still wasn't sure which. That was when the psychological warfare started. Notes left on my door, dripping with sarcasm: maybe get louder coffee next time, or, your dog seems lonely, maybe it needs a friend. All trivial, yet irritating, a constant drip that made me question my own tolerance. Every evening, I'd find footprints across my freshly cleaned porch, cans tossed over the fence, and sometimes, graffiti on the side of my house. It wasn't just about noise anymore, it was about claiming territory, asserting dominance, and watching me squirm. The local authorities offered little relief. Complaints led to polite warnings that went unheeded. Every time I called, I felt the same helpless frustration. They were clever, organized, and immune to consequences, always skirting the rules while testing my patience. Sleep became impossible. I tried earplugs, white noise machines, even late-night walks to escape the madness, but the chaos followed me everywhere. And the worst part? The neighbors weren't just loud, they were smart about it. They timed every disruptive act to hit the moments when I needed peace most. Sunday mornings, evenings when I worked from home, nights when I tried to get a few hours of sleep, they had a sense of timing that made their attacks feel personal. I wasn't just living next to bad neighbors, I was living next to people who thrived on watching my life unravel. By the end of that second week, the mental toll was undeniable. The anger bubbling inside me wasn't just frustration anymore, it was righteous fury. And that's when I knew ignoring them or hoping they would magically change wasn't an option. If I wanted to survive, I had to fight back. But fighting back meant strategy, patience, and planning. I wasn't going to let them ruin my home without paying a price. By the third week, the chaos had evolved from maddening to outright hostile. It was no longer random annoyances or thoughtless pranks, they had become strategic. Every morning I'd wake up to something new, a pile of broken garden gnomes on my lawn, birdseed scattered across my driveway as if to lure wildlife into my yard, and the incessant beeping of some electronic device they had rigged outside my window. I started to dread even stepping outside. My own home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. One night, I stayed up late, watching through my blinds as they gathered on their porch. I realized then that they weren't just careless, they were orchestrating a spectacle. Flashing lights, loudspeakers, even what appeared to be homemade fireworks. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I knew at that moment, these weren't petty neighbors. These were people who had made it their mission to dismantle my life, brick by brick, sound by sound, with a smile on their faces. Even my pets were affected. My dog, usually cheerful and calm, would growl at the fence, ears pinned back, clearly disturbed by whatever new torment they had concocted. I found myself apologizing to him, frustrated and powerless. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by anxiety and plotting. Every day I walked on eggshells, afraid that leaving the house would invite yet another spectacle of harassment. The community started noticing too. One neighbor mentioned hearing the commotion, but when I tried to rally support, I realized nobody wanted to get involved. "It's their property, you know," they'd say. "We just try to ignore them." I understood then the terrifying truth: no one was coming to save me. I was entirely alone in this, against people who thrived on cruelty. And yet, amidst the despair, a strange clarity emerged. I began taking notes, recording incidents, documenting patterns. Every prank, every attack, every invasion of my space was catalogued. It was meticulous work, but necessary. I needed to understand their rhythm, their habits, their weaknesses. The realization settled like a weight in my chest: if I was going to survive, I had to become smarter than them. I couldn't just react anymore, I needed a plan, a precise, unrelenting plan. By the end of the third week, my anger had solidified into resolve. I was no longer just a victim. I was becoming a strategist, studying my adversaries, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The chaos had forced me into a corner, but it had also sharpened my mind and my focus. The war was far from over, and soon, they would see that the quiet, unassuming neighbor they had tormented was capable of far more than they could imagine. By the fourth week, I knew that reacting emotionally wouldn't work. I had to think like a chess player. Every prank they pulled, every loud blare of music, every errant package left on my porch became data points. I started mapping their daily routines: when they left the house, when their friends came over, even which windows they never closed. I observed patterns in their arrogance, the little habits they thought no one noticed. Each small oversight became a potential opening for my counterattack. I began collecting tools and materials, nothing illegal, just things that would allow me to quietly and safely assert control over my own property while subtly undermining theirs. Motion sensor cameras disguised in harmless objects, clever devices that made small but noticeable disturbances in their own routines, and a record-keeping system so thorough I could anticipate their every move. Every late night was spent designing contingencies, imagining what I could do if they escalated further, and planning my steps 2 moves ahead. But the plan wasn't just about retaliation, it was about reclaiming my peace of mind. I started to visualize small victories, like turning their loud music into their own problem, or having them step into harmless but inconvenient surprises that would teach them consequences without leaving me exposed. I realized that subtlety would be my greatest weapon, overt actions would only escalate the conflict. The goal wasn't destruction, it was control, balance, and finally, respect for boundaries. I also researched psychology, reading about how people escalate conflicts and what motivates those who enjoy tormenting others. It became clear that their power came from anonymity and predictability. They assumed I'd never fight back, that I was too polite or passive to act. That assumption was about to be shattered. My entire household became a quiet war room, a nerve center for the unfolding strategy, where even mundane objects could become instruments of leverage. By the end of the 4th week, my plan was nearly complete. It wasn't revenge for the sake of vengeance, it was about reclaiming my life, my peace, and my sense of safety. I was ready for the next phase, the execution. And as I looked at the neighbor's house through my binoculars one night, I felt a strange thrill. The same people who had made my life miserable were about to discover that tormenting the wrong neighbor comes with consequences they could never anticipate. Execution began subtly. I wasn't looking for fireworks, I wanted the kind of annoyance that would make them second-guess their own behavior. That Monday morning, I set up a small, harmless rig that made their mailbox flap open and close repeatedly whenever they approached, enough to startle them and confuse anyone watching from the street. It was petty, yes, but the point wasn't immediate destruction, it was psychological. Every little disruption was a reminder that their actions had consequences, and that I was watching, thinking, and acting. Next came their parking habits. They were notorious for leaving their car half blocking my driveway, assuming I'd just move around it. One evening, I quietly placed small, wedge-shaped rubber chocks behind their tires. Nothing permanent, nothing dangerous, just enough to make the car stick slightly if they tried to back out too fast. The first time they struggled, I watched from my window, barely hiding a smirk as frustration registered on their faces. They couldn't understand why these minor annoyances kept happening. I also began exploiting their pet peeves. The neighbors had a garden they prided themselves on, but left a section near my fence poorly maintained. I started planting fast-growing wildflowers in that narrow strip, so they'd be forced to deal with weeds that kept spilling into their pristine section. Every day they'd have to pull out a few more sprouts, never knowing that it wasn't just nature's whim, it was me, quietly imposing a consequence for their own chaos. Social pressure became another tool. They liked hosting noisy gatherings, believing everyone tolerated it. I started documenting their parties, footage of late-night music, trash spilling onto the street, and general disorder. Not for the authorities, not yet. But as leverage, knowing that in time it could be used to make them reconsider their entitlement. This wasn't escalation yet, it was foundation laying, planting seeds that would grow into realization and discomfort. By the end of the week, I felt a rush of empowerment. I wasn't powerless anymore. The neighborhood torment wasn't ending with explosive confrontations, it was ending with them slowly realizing that their reign over the block had quietly eroded. I had shifted the balance without ever being overtly aggressive. Every morning, I checked their reactions from my window, observing confusion, irritation, and the faint beginnings of paranoia. This was only the start. By the time the weekend rolled around, I realized subtle annoyances weren't enough. They were clever, yes, but I needed a plan that would hit harder, without breaking the law, without giving them any immediate proof pointing back at me. I spent hours that Saturday mapping out their routines, when they left for work, when their friends came over, how they stored things in their garage. Every detail mattered. Knowledge is power, and I was gathering all the ammunition I needed for the long game. I started small, innocuous tests. A loose garden hose that slightly sprayed their walkway whenever someone opened the gate. A misplaced trash can lid that rolled down the driveway at odd hours. Nothing that could be called damage, but enough to make them question their own sanity. Each tiny disruption was also a learning opportunity. I could see how they reacted, what patterns they followed, and how easily they could be flustered. Next, I observed their tech habits. Security cameras. A few, yes, but blind spots were plenty. I noted which angles were covered and which weren't. I didn't need to hack or tamper with anything, I just needed awareness. Phones, Wi-Fi routers, and the way they left windows unlocked gave me the perfect mental map of their vulnerabilities. I wasn't planning to break in, I was planning to exploit their overconfidence subtly, in ways they wouldn't immediately trace back to me. I also began crafting distractions. Random noise, slight disturbances, a mailbox that seemed to mysteriously tip over occasionally. Each act was timed and executed to build anticipation, to teach them that the world around them wasn't entirely under their control. I realized that the most effective revenge isn't rage, it's patience and precision. It's making someone feel the creeping discomfort of being watched, of being unsettled, without ever knowing why. Finally, I created contingencies. They had friends and family who could intervene, neighbors who might witness my actions, and my own schedule to maintain. I made detailed notes, using a small notebook like a general planning a campaign. Every step accounted for, every possible countermeasure anticipated. By the time I closed that notebook Saturday night, I felt a sense of calm focus. The minor annoyances were just the prelude, now I was ready for the real act of justice. By Monday morning, I was ready to escalate from minor inconveniences to something more deliberate. I had studied their schedules like a detective, memorized the times they left for work, the hours when their kids got off the bus, even the small rituals that made their mornings predictable. The first step was creating an illusion of normalcy while setting the pieces in place. To anyone looking from outside, it seemed like a quiet week, but inside, I was orchestrating a carefully timed symphony. I started with small, strategic placements. A misplaced garden gnome here, a slightly misaligned welcome mat there, tiny nudges that suggested carelessness on their part. I wanted them to doubt themselves before the bigger moves even began. Simultaneously, I began documenting everything. Photos of their routine, notes on the patterns I noticed, timestamps of when things happened. It was meticulous, almost obsessive, but I knew precision was essential. Sloppy execution could ruin everything. Next, I enlisted helpers without their knowledge. Neighborhood cats, a stray dog that seemed to love their backyard, even the wind itself, every natural element became a tool in my plan. I didn't touch anything illegal, but I manipulated the environment in subtle ways, loose pavers that shifted underfoot, a sprinkler that mysteriously turned on at odd hours, leaves arranged in inconvenient paths. Each small act was like a note in a crescendo I was composing for them. Communication was another layer. I started responding to their casual neighborly messages in overly polite but slightly off ways. "Oh, I didn't notice that," or "thanks, I guess," said with just the right tone to plant uncertainty. It wasn't confrontational, it was designed to make them second-guess interactions. They were so used to being the dominant force in our little block that even minor social friction unsettled them. Finally, I set my own schedule to coincide with theirs. Every step, every placement, every distraction was timed to the minute. I even practiced what I would do if they confronted me or noticed something amiss. Anticipating their reactions became part of the thrill, an intellectual chess match that no one else knew was happening. By the end of the week, the foundation was set. The subtle chaos was ready to grow, and I was finally prepared to move from observation and planning to the act itself. The weekend arrived, and the neighborhood felt deceptively quiet, like the calm before a storm. I began implementing the first real strikes of my plan, the ones that would wake them from their sense of untouchable comfort. Nothing violent, nothing illegal, just chaos so precise it would make them question their own homes. I started with the garden. Overnight, I repositioned every outdoor chair, table, and decorative item in ways that looked accidental but would frustrate them to no end. One by one, they noticed, first the glares at the misaligned flower pots, then the muttered curses over the subtly tipped bird feeders. Inside their house, I manipulated simple inconveniences. A loose screw on a cabinet door here, a subtly miscalibrated thermostat there, lights flickering at odd intervals, all designed to make them doubt their senses. I watched from my window, hidden, as they fumbled to correct things that never needed fixing. Their frustrations grew visible, their tempers flaring in small, explosive ways that became more intense with each day. I kept detailed notes, each reaction was data for the next move. Then came the psychological layer. I introduced mysterious notes left at their door, polite, anonymous, with slightly unsettling messages. Hope your day goes, interestingly, or, funny how things always change overnight. Harmless on the surface. But combined with the subtle chaos, it planted seeds of paranoia. I observed them checking doors repeatedly, retracing steps, second-guessing the simplest routines. Every glance they threw in my direction, I returned with a calm, knowing smile, like a cat watching a mouse slowly unravel. By the third night, I added another element, sound. The creaking floorboards, the distant knocks, the soft scuffing of shoes just outside their windows, nothing consistent, nothing traceable. It was enough to unsettle them, to make them feel like their sanctuary was no longer their own. Their sleep began to suffer, their arguments inside the house more frequent and louder. The neighborhood, which had been my silent ally in observation, now became a stage for the subtle unraveling of their control. Finally, I watched them slump into fatigue one evening, defeated by their own paranoia. It was working. The dominoes were tipping, one subtle inconvenience at a time, and the real game, the intricate part of my plan, was about to begin. Their sense of dominance, of untouchable authority, was eroding. And all of it had started with careful observation, patience, and the deliberate placement of chaos. By now, the neighbors were walking on eggshells. Their once confident steps were hesitant, their sharp words softened into muttered complaints to anyone who would listen. I had documented every habit, every pattern, every little obsession they couldn't live without. It was time to escalate, carefully, deliberately, and creatively. I started assembling what I called the final traps, small actions that seemed coincidental but were impossible to ignore when combined. First, the mailbox. Not broken, just subtly tampered with, so that letters and packages occasionally fell to the ground. A missed delivery here, a soggy magazine there, nothing overtly threatening, but enough to make them constantly check, recheck, and curse the postal service. Next, their garbage routine. I timed when the bins were set out, then adjusted them ever so slightly after they returned inside. A simple rotation of the wheels or a small, unseen obstacle on the path, enough to frustrate without leaving proof. I also began targeting their social visibility. Anonymous compliments, slightly mocking notes, and even friendly but cryptic messages to mutual neighbors. Funny, I could have sworn I saw the Johnsons acting strangely last night, little hints that made them feel watched, that others might notice what they didn't. By planting these seeds, I created a network of doubt and embarrassment that slowly crept into their interactions beyond our street. Inside their home, I made subtle adjustments to their routines, a faucet handle tightened just enough to leak later, a closet door that wouldn't fully close until nudged repeatedly, lights that flickered at the edge of perception. All of it designed to make them feel out of control in the spaces they thought were entirely theirs. I watched their reactions with a mix of satisfaction and awe. People could unravel so quickly when the foundation of certainty was removed. Finally, I prepared the piece de resistance. The ultimate disruption that would bring the culmination of all my careful planning into focus. Every step taken, every reaction recorded, every subtle irritation fed into this final act. It wasn't about humiliation or cruelty, it was about restoring balance, about demonstrating that even those who believe themselves untouchable could be reminded that their actions had consequences. The stage was set, the dominoes aligned, and the final sequence was ready to unfold. It started with what seemed like a minor inconvenience. One morning, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson found their driveway subtly blocked, not by anything permanent, just a few strategically placed garden pots and a harmless traffic cone. To the untrained eye, it looked like an accident, maybe a delivery truck left them there, but to the Hendersons, it was another piece of a growing puzzle. Frustration rippled across their faces as they circled their car multiple times, trying to find a way out without drawing the attention of neighbors. Inside, more small disruptions unfolded simultaneously. Their morning coffee, meticulously prepared every day, was slightly off, not spoiled, just enough to irritate. Their favorite mug had been repositioned, the spoon placed in a different drawer. Each tiny alteration accumulated, gnawing at their sense of control, leaving them irritable, distracted, and increasingly paranoid. I monitored every reaction, recording their subtle slips. The slammed doors, the muttered curses, the questioning glances at each other. It wasn't chaos yet, it was methodical erosion of their composure. What was once routine had become a minefield. Then came the neighborhood whispers. I had discreetly shared small, ambiguous notes with nearby neighbors, hints of odd behavior without revealing too much. Suddenly, the Hendersons were unsure whom to trust. Friendly waves were met with suspicious frowns, casual remarks twisted into potential gossip. Their social comfort, once taken for granted, started to crumble. By the evening, they were visibly worn down. Their sharp, loud arguments, once a nightly symphony, had diminished into tense, low murmurs. The first domino had fallen, and the rest were aligned perfectly. I knew from experience that once the seed of doubt and discomfort took root, it wouldn't need much to grow into full-blown disarray. And I watched, knowing the next act was imminent. By the time part 11 rolled around, the Hendersons were teetering on the edge of total frustration, and I knew it was the perfect moment to escalate. I retreated into careful planning, making sure every step of my strategy was precise, like a chess player considering 10 moves ahead. I didn't want chaos for the sake of chaos, I wanted the tipping point to be undeniable, a turning point they would remember for years. I started with reconnaissance. Every habit, every routine, every minor annoyance they indulged in became data for my plan. Their grocery runs, preferred TV shows, even the times they liked to nap, all catalogued. I learned the rhythm of their life so well that predicting their next action felt almost too easy. At night, I would sit with a notebook and a cup of tea, mapping patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. Next came the tactical phase. I procured tools that would allow me to subtly manipulate their environment without exposing myself. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable. Just small, psychological nudges, squeaky hinges, misaligned picture frames, mysterious little notes, subtle but noticeable. Each piece was designed to make them question reality without them knowing the hand behind it. I also recruited a few allies. Not to act on my behalf, but to amplify the effect naturally. A friendly neighbor might accidentally mention a strange sighting, a passerby could ask oddly personal questions, all feeding the illusion of a neighborhood conspiracy. Every element had to feel organic, forced theatrics would ruin the subtlety. Finally, I took a step back to consider the endgame. I didn't want them destroyed, only humbled, only to feel the same irritation and helplessness they had inflicted on others. I imagined their faces when the first major move landed perfectly. That vision, vivid and precise, drove my next actions. I was no longer the observer. I was the architect of an experience that would culminate in undeniable justice, and I relished the anticipation. With the plan meticulously drafted, I began the slow, deliberate execution. Each trap was subtle, almost invisible, designed to frustrate without ever leaving direct evidence of my involvement. I started with the small annoyances, the squeaky hinge on their front gate that refused to stay quiet, a faint dripping sound from a faucet they couldn't locate, misaligned mail in the mailbox. Each irritation was calibrated to escalate slowly, building tension without obvious cause. I also planted coincidences around the neighborhood. A loose garden gnome that seemed to appear in different spots, a missing flower from their front yard that somehow reappeared elsewhere. These small disturbances started to mess with their sense of control. My allies played their part too, casually mentioning odd sightings or strange noises they'd noticed, always keeping the illusion organic. Inside the house, I focused on psychological triggers. I knew they loved routines, so I disrupted them gently. The morning coffee would taste slightly off, the TV remote would hide just enough to cause irritation, a power outlet would flicker intermittently during peak moments of their favorite shows. Each tiny disruption was like a carefully placed domino, set to topple at just the right time. I documented everything. Photos, notes, timestamps, everything that could give me insight into how each trap was affecting them. I wasn't acting recklessly, I was conducting an experiment, observing their reactions, adjusting the plan as needed. The tension in the air became almost palpable, and I could feel the crescendo approaching. By the end of this phase, the Hendersons were on edge. They didn't yet know I was behind it, but they could feel the shift. Every day brought a new, inexplicable irritation, and they started to argue more frequently, grow restless, and question each other. The slow burn was working exactly as intended. After weeks of subtly eroding their sense of peace, I moved into the final stage. The Hendersons were jittery, snapping at each other over trivial things, their tempers frayed, every day a little more chaotic. I had observed patterns in their routines, little habits that were predictable, and now I could use those patterns to orchestrate the big reveal. I introduced one last series of accidents, each carefully timed. A bucket of water precariously balanced above the back door, a deliberately misaligned step in their garden path, a misplaced ladder near their prized rose bushes. The goal wasn't physical harm, it was psychological and symbolic. I wanted them to feel the weight of their misdeeds against me, to understand in their bones that their complacency and arrogance had consequences. At night, I monitored everything. The house creaked, the floorboards groaned, shadows shifted in the dim streetlights, everything choreographed to amplify their paranoia. I sent anonymous notes, subtle hints about someone watching, you know what you did, scribbled on a piece of paper, left where they'd find it in the kitchen. Every element was designed to push them to the brink, without crossing the line into illegal territory. By the end of the setup, the Hendersons were walking on eggshells. They whispered about curses, misfortune, even imagined enemies outside their own walls. I watched from my porch across the street, pretending to read a book, seeing the tension boil to perfection. Every detail of my plan had come together, the chaos, the uncertainty, the constant unease. The final act was about to unfold, and there was a peculiar satisfaction in knowing that the Hendersons, who had made my life unbearable for months, were now trapped in their own anxiety. The Hendersons' paranoia had reached a fever pitch. They barely slept, double-checked locks, and argued incessantly over imagined threats. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the yard, every minor mishap felt like a confirmation that something, or someone, was tormenting them. I watched it all unfold from my window, notebook in hand, recording reactions, subtle patterns of fear, and the cracks in their composure. Then came the reveal, though I never directly confronted them. I left a single, unmistakable clue in the mailbox, a simple envelope with a photo I'd snapped of their loudest, most obnoxious act from months ago, paired with a brief note, "You brought this on yourselves." It wasn't threatening, but it hit exactly where it was meant to. I saw the color drain from their faces when they found it, the tension between them turning into fear, guilt, and suspicion. Neighbors whispered, deliveries arrived late, and every sound seemed amplified. The Hendersons were unraveling publicly now, their neighbors watching them with raised eyebrows, sensing the invisible pressure that had been mounting. They were no longer bullies, they were captives of their own environment, their actions reflecting back in every sleepless night and tense conversation. And through it all, I stayed invisible, a silent conductor of their unraveling. The satisfaction was subtle, psychological, not cruel, an elegant justice that required patience, observation, and the willingness to play the long game. Finally, they were broken in ways only their conscience could understand, and the neighborhood felt quieter, calmer, as if a storm had passed. I sipped my coffee on the porch, smiling lightly, knowing that the Hendersons would never forget the lessons of humility, respect, and the consequences of crossing the wrong neighbor. The Hendersons never left the house for more than a few minutes at a time without casting nervous glances around. Their once loud, arrogant presence had shrunk into whispers and hurried movements. I would see them in the yard, fiddling with their fences, peeking through curtains, or arguing over minor household issues with an edge of panic that wasn't there before. The neighborhood itself seemed to breathe easier, quieter, as if the tension they'd brought had finally lifted. I, on the other hand, had gained something I hadn't anticipated, a sense of calm and closure. Watching them unravel taught me patience, precision, and the subtle power of observation. The justice I meted out wasn't violent or overtly cruel, it was psychological, methodical, and invisible to the outside world, but it worked in ways that mattered. People who once dismissed me now gave me polite nods, unaware of the silent storm I'd orchestrated. And most importantly, I reflected on myself. Revenge is not about hatred. It's about reclaiming control, setting boundaries, and ensuring that toxic behavior is met with consequence. The Hendersons were a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance and cruelty never go unchecked if someone is willing to wait, plan, and act with subtlety. I finally closed my notebook, leaned back in my chair, and watched the sunset over the quiet street. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The neighborhood had regained its balance, and so had I. In the end, sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones you hardly have to announce, the ones that unfold quietly, leaving a lasting impression without a single shout.